In the name of the one holy and living God. My earliest memory as a child is perhaps a bit peculiar. When I was 3 years old, my father carried me into a small booth with curtains on all four sides. I watched as my dad picked up a small wooden ink stamp, and then I saw him stamp an X on a piece of paper. And then he told me he had just voted for President Eisenhower. At age 3, I could not have told you what voting was, or what a president was, or what an Eisenhower was. But politics, for better or for worse, was indelibly stamped on my soul. Now, I know, we are all very weary of politics. But like many of you, I have been thinking a lot lately about our election that will be upon us in 2 weeks. This will be the 18th presidential election of my lifetime, and the 14th in which I have cast a vote. There is a temptation, I think, to see elections as something done to us, not as something we do. It is not hard to see why. We are inundated daily with barrages of mailers, television commercials, social media posts and ads, text messages begging for money, and daily tracking polls that tell us how we will vote even before we've decided how to vote. It can feel as though whatever power we have as voters is taken away from us before we ever vote. There is also a temptation to see the church as a refuge from the noise of elections and nothing more. We heard an echo of that in the first line of the psalm today. And it's not hard to see why we feel this is and should be a refuge. We come together on Sundays to worship and to pray, to be with each other, and to create a safe place where all are welcome. The problem with this is, sooner or later, we will run headlong into those Old Testament prophets who call us to act, not just find a safe corner. And we will run headlong into Jesus, who challenges us to take up our cross and follow him into some very uncomfortable places. So this morning, I want to hit the pause button on the election for a few minutes. And I want to reflect with you this morning about our Christian faith and our democracy. The gospel lesson will take us there, and I will get to the gospel in a bit, but stick with me for a while first. First, I am certainly not going to tell you how to vote, or who to vote for, or how to vote on any issues. I am not going to provide you with any easy answers. I have seen a lot of politics up close and personal. As many of you know, before I was a priest, I was a journalist. I spent half of my adult life as a daily newspaper reporter, most of that time writing about politics and elections. I cut my rookie teeth in the 1970s covering the hotly contested race for the Riverside County Mosquito Abatement District. It was a hot race. I have covered 3 U.S. Senate elections, 4 presidential elections, most extensively and intensively in 1992 following incumbent President George H.W. Bush and his challenger Bill Clinton. By the way, when that election was over, I entered the ordination process to become an Episcopal priest. But that is another story for another day. Since my time as a political writer, politics has gotten more personal, noisy, divisive, crude, and just plain nasty. And I know that for many, politics has become a dirty word, and I get it. However, at its most basic, politics is about how we structure our life in common, whether in our families or our workplaces or in governments at every level and between nations. We can attempt to ignore politics, but we can't live without politics if we are to live together. We often hear the phrase, the separation of church and state. The phrase is often interpreted as an admonition that church should stay out of politics. However, the phrase separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution. Rather, the First Amendment to the Constitution states this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, there is to be no official religion in our nation, not Christianity, not anything. And there should be no official religion in our government. And the government cannot impede the practice of religion. The government cannot impede the practice of any religion. But separation of church and state does not mean separation of our faith from our participation in democracy, or separation of our faith from anything else we do in life. Our faith is not just between these walls on Sunday. Yet there is a huge tension here, and we need to acknowledge it. Political agendas are shaped by human beings, and human agendas are not necessarily shaped by faith, even when they purport to be. We have seen political agendas from churches in the name of God that may seem far from God. How do we know the difference? I recently read an article by N.T. Wright, who is a Church of England bishop and a prominent, renowned New Testament scholar. He observed that there hasn't been much written about the theology of politics in the last 200 to 300 years. At first, I disagreed. Surely he can't be right. So I took a deep dive into what I could find from recent theologians, church historians, sociologists, political philosophers. I've done a lot of reading in the last month. As it turns out, N.T. Wright was mostly right. There isn't much written about faith and democracy, but there are some profound examples in recent times. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote extensively about the theology of politics and Christian morality in the 1940s. as did a few African American theologians in the 1950s and 60s. But in fact, through most of Christian history, theological thinking about politics and government has been focused on how to live in a monarchy, not how to participate in a democracy. Robert Bellah, among the most insightful commentators on religion and politics in the 20th century, notes, most Christian theorists down through the ages have considered monarchy the best form of government. Yet, as Bellah notes, we aren't subjects in a monarchy. We are citizens in a republic. We are a self-governing people. We have a vote. Agency is ours. We are the government. Bellah, a University of California professor, and by the way, an Episcopalian, also gave what he called a sobering note. Most of what is good and most of what is bad in our history is rooted in our public theology. Churches don't always get it right. With that in mind, as this next election looms, I am inviting us into a conversation. I'm inviting us to consider, what is our role as faithful people, as Christians, in a democratic republic? I realize not everyone here is a citizen, and not everyone here can vote for many different reasons. But also consider, some of the most courageous prophets and activists of justice in American history were denied the vote, including African Americans until recent times. And half the white population couldn't vote until 1920, when women were given the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. Well, even if we can't vote, how do we live out our faith in whatever ways we can, even when our rights are limited or curtailed? We can start by asking ourselves, what values do we bring to our participation in democracy? What Christian values do we bring to our participation in democracy? When I covered politics as a reporter, there was one adage looming far above all others that we were always looking at. People vote their pocketbook. People vote their pocketbook. Bill Clinton's headquarters, his campaign headquarters, even had a banner emblazoned with, "It's the economy, stupid," as a reminder to Clinton, always talk about the pocketbook. Well, certainly economics matter. Jobs and income matter. Affordability of food and housing, medicine, and basic necessities matter. But as Christians, should our personal pocketbook always rank as our highest value? Is there something more our faith gives us than our self-interest? After all, Jesus said not to worry about what you drink or eat or the clothes on your back. As Christians, what are our highest values? Recently here at Trinity Cathedral, we launched Plumline groups to have a deep conversation about our values. Some of you are participating. The phrase plumline comes from a passage from the prophet Amos, who uses it as a metaphor for the boundaries of our values. Lori and I have been participating in one of these groups on Monday evenings. We've had a rich conversation about our family values, what we grew up with, the values our culture imposes on us, and our own personal values. And what we've discovered is these values are often in a lot of conflict. But what of the values of our faith? What values are highest in our faith? Most recently, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, reminded us that Jesus proclaims over and over, our highest value is the love of God and the love of neighbor. The love of God, the love of neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Bishop Curry further says that the letters of the Apostle Paul, often misunderstood, actually underline how Christians are to live with whatever form of government they find themselves in or imposed upon them. Curry says this, he grounds this, Paul he's speaking of, he grounds this in Jesus' call to love your neighbor as yourself. One of the most influential black theologians of the civil rights era, Howard Thurman, wrote this, a man must love his neighbor directly, clearly, permitting no barriers between. But what does love of neighbor look like? It's not always easy to figure out. There are a lot of issues where it's really not clear. But put another way, how do we love our neighbor through our participation in democracy? Today's gospel from Mark takes us straight there. The story begins with two self-absorbed disciples, the brothers James and John, looking out for their self-interest, asking Jesus for the best seats in heaven. They are so wrapped up in their worries about the hereafter, they are forgetting about the here and now. These two dear sons of Zebedee just don't get what Jesus is trying to teach. Life is hard, they say, so give us the best season tickets for eternity. We'd really appreciate it. But Jesus offers a much more radical notion. The greatest among you is not the one who lives a pure, unblemished life. The greatest among you is not the one who has risen to the most exalted rank in the church or in politics or business or is the richest billionaire in the world. Among the Gentiles, Jesus says, and we're the Gentiles, those they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. Jesus explains to James and John a new way of life, a different way of thinking, a life based not on having the best seat or the fanciest title, but a life based on generosity and self-sacrifice. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. If you want to be great, become a servant. The greatest among us are those who are compassionate servants, loving their neighbors as themselves. Well, what if we look at our vote through the lens of a life of service? This life Jesus describes. How would we do that? We could begin by examining the values of the candidates. Do their values reflect serving the common good, or do they serve a narrow interest? Is what they do based on fear and hate, or love and compassion? Are their actions primarily about self-interest or common interest? Do they inspire us to love our neighbors or divide us from each other? At the dawn of the Second World War, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr underlined this other value of Christian faith. He wrote this: equality is a higher social goal than peace. Put another way, there can never be true peace without true justice. Are the candidates committed to equal justice for all or just a few? Yet, candidates aren't just a collection of policy position papers. Candidates are human, and some of them are very human. In my many years covering candidates from the lowest of offices to the highest, from the mosquito abatement district to the presidency, I have never met a candidate who did not have personal flaws, who hadn't made mistakes in life. The question is, what did they learn? Do they take responsibility, or do they double down? Do they grow? Value shapes character. Values shape character. One more thing. One last thing. Voting is important, but our life of faith is more than about voting. Our values shape all that we say and do. We should ask the same questions of ourselves we ask our candidates. Are we compassionate, generous, honest, loving our neighbors, open to each other, servants to those the most in need? Martin Luther King used to say over and over, all of us can be great. All of us can be great because all of us can serve. All of us can serve. Well, we know our government and our leaders won't always get it right, and neither will we. And I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. I certainly don't know who's going to win this election. But I do know this. The good Lord is with us always, everywhere. So I leave you with a blessing the Apostle Paul gave to the Christians in the Greek city of Philippi. They were persecuted. They lived under an oppressive government, and they worried about their future. They worried about their very survival. Rejoice in the Lord always, Paul tells them. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.